Okay, so for this second lecture in this three-part lecture series on Plato's Symposium, let's gather together what we said last time in outline form, and let me point forward to what I'd like to talk about today. So let's not forget our task. We're trying to extract some key moral themes from Plato's philosophy. And I was saying last time that if you take the Plato's seventh letter seriously, where he says that nowhere has he written his philosophy down, and then you take the fact that the dialogues, which are all we have besides the seventh letter uh, of Plato's philosophy, we take with seriously the fact that these dialogues are artistic as well as philosophical, then we're posed with some philological challenges. These challenges are unique to Plato. You won't find it in any other philosopher in the same way. Other philosophers are difficult, but for different reasons. The difficulty here is to move into the neighborhood of Plato's philosophy without reading extraneous ideas into his thought. And that takes some finesse. I told you my way of doing it is to, as you study Plato, you get to understand other dialogues, and then you can use those other dialogues to shine light on passages from the dialogue you're studying. But even if you are starting as you are with this one dialogue, the Symposium, um, you can use parts of the dialogue to shine light on the part that you're trying to interpret. So the task is to move into the neighborhood of Plato's philosophy. Now, I think it's legitimate to say that Socrates' position in the dialogues are within the neighborhood of Plato's thought. But let's think about what's going on. Plato's writing all these dialogues. In the dialogue, there are all these characters. The conversation is moving and changing, and the key character is Socrates, who's Plato's most influential predecessor. So Plato is, there was a historical Socrates, I told you that, but he didn't write anything. So all we have are Plato's view of Socrates. Well, we have Xenophon also, who's like Plato, only not so important as Plato, and Xenophon claims to be much more historically. He wrote about Socrates also. But we learn about Socrates mostly from the Socrates that appears in Plato's philosophy. Now, what Socrates says there is also in dialogue form. He's in dialogue with people. So when you quote Plato, you have to be very careful. Um, when you have a quotation, you have to say who is speaking. That's very important. And I'm going to ask you to use quotations or at least paraphrase supporting things from the text. You need, if you make a quote from Plato's philosophy, you have to say who's speaking. So we all know Plato wrote everything, but different people speak. And the things that they say are not always Plato's position. In fact, in some cases, they're the opposite of Plato's position, or perhaps they're in the ideas are on the way, but Plato takes them up and tweaks them and recasts them and gives the same word different meanings. Okay, so I don't mean to confuse you. I just want to alert you to this fact. When you quote Plato, always say who's speaking, and the key to all interpretation is context, especially when you're quoting from a dialogue. The dialogue is moving, so you need to understand if when you're interpreting what somebody says, you have to return it to the context in which it's said and the person who's speaking. Okay, so I gave you the structure of the dialogue. That's pretty obvious. There's this introductory dialogue, and then we move into the introductory dialogue is a certain Apollodorus is speaking to an unnamed friend. The unnamed friend is asking him what happened like 16 years ago or a long time ago at the home of Agathon in 416 BC. And he says to the unnamed friend, who perhaps could be the reader, could be us. That's Plato's way of getting us into the dialogue, as though we're asking what happened at Agathon's home. And then he says to this unnamed friend that he wasn't there, but he was. He knows somebody who was there, a certain Aristodemus, who was a disciple of Socrates, and Aristodemus was there with Socrates, and Aristodemus told Apollodorus. Now Apollodorus is telling that to the unnamed friend. So that's the structure of. So the whole thing is coming from the mouth of Apollodorus, but we're taken into the dialogue by Apollodorus is narrating what happened. So we're taken into that narration, and there we are with Socrates and Aristodemus on the way to Agathon's home. And I told you there's certain things that are said there where if you have some finesse in your interpretation, you can find your way into the neighborhood of Plato's philosophy. For example, I mentioned this, and I won't belabor it anymore, but it's an important point. It's not just some insignificant thing that he has Socrates show up late to the party, and we find out that this is his habit, and that finally he arrives much later, even after dinner, and what he was doing was thinking. Okay, so how does that help us to understand Plato's moral philosophy? Well, I know Plato enough to know that he's going to say the main question of moral philosophy, I told you in the broadest sense, is how should human beings live? And on an individual level, or even on a political level, he wants the political rulers, and he wants individuals, even if they're not political rulers, if they want to live well, live a good life, they have to live philosophically. So having Socrates show up late to the party gives us an image of somebody who's living philosophically. He's examining life. He's putting qualitative thought into life. He's entering into an inner dialogue about some ultimate issue. And so, indirectly, then, Plato's dramatizing how to live philosophically. Well, what does it mean? Well, the key part of living philosophically is to think, put some thought into life, examine life. So that's why he has them come late. And then even you can continue with that little scenario and find sometimes the most seemingly insignificant things that take place are insightful, but you have to go slowly and carefully and try to find your way to the neighborhood of Plato's philosophy. For example, to continue with that little scenario. Okay, so Socrates shows up late. Aristodemus, has been there already. They accepted him, and Agathon greets him. It's Agathon's home. It's his party. Oh, Socrates, come sit next to me so that I can share into that thought that struck you at the porch next door. Well, if you go very slowly and think about that, the way that's phrased, let me share into that thought that struck you as you stood there at the porch next door. Don't think of little porches like in suburbia either. The Greek homes were probably miles apart. I picture him standing overlooking the countryside. Okay, so thoughts strike us. Plato wrote this, right? And he very carefully said it that way. He has Agathon say, let me share that thought that must have struck you. So thoughts strike us. We don't generate thoughts. It's not some ego that's producing the thought. It's rather the thought that strikes us when we're ready to receive it. I find that very profound. And that's just a little passing remark, but I'm trying to illustrate. I can't do that for every little thing in the dialogue. We'd be here, all semester. I'm just trying to illustrate to you the more thoughtful way of approaching the dialogues. And of course, you can't do that for every little thing that happens. And sometimes insignificant things are just insignificant, too. You have to use your common sense. But that's not insignificant. I find that insightful. Okay, so How might that reflect? Well, allow yourself to be open. Know that you don't know when it comes to ultimate issues. Admit that to yourself. And that's called Socratic ignorance. Have you ever tried to teach someone something who thinks they know it already? It's impossible. The only way you can get through is to get them somehow to admit to themselves that they don't know. Then, okay, then they can learn. So they have to get out of the way. So there's a certain learned ignorance, which is the condition for the possibility of a great thought that will strike you. That's why, have you ever noticed that sometimes in your most relaxed, most leisurely attitude, the most profound idea will strike you? It's because you got out of the way. So these are this is the way I approach the dialogues, like a literary critic, with very close scrutiny to the text. But unlike literary critics, sometimes they miss the big philosophical points. So you want to combine the sensitivity and close reading of literary criticism with the deep insights of the philosopher. That's been my formula for interpreting. So, and then Socrates, you can continue with that if you like. I mentioned this already, so I won't belabor it, but I'll mention it again since we're talking about this incident. And then Socrates responds to that when Agathon says, "Sit next to me so that I can share in that thought that struck you." If only wisdom were that way, Agathon, that it went from the overfull cup to the empty cup. So that's Plato's way of indirectly telling the reader that there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge goes from somebody who doesn't know, from somebody who knows to somebody who doesn't know. But wisdom doesn't move that way. Wisdom comes only after long dialogue and shedding of ignorance and rethinking ultimate issues. So that's an illustration of how you can find your way to Plato's moral philosophy by taking uh, the text and asking yourself, if Plato were here and I were to ask him, like, why did you have Socrates come home late? Why did you have, or come to the party late? Why did you have Agathon say that? And so on and so forth. And then the more you know Plato, the more you could interpret that in such a way that it reflects his moral philosophy. That's why, especially at the beginning, since most of you, it's your first experience with reading a Platonic dialogue, then you need a teacher. That's why I'm here. But then later on, you become your own teacher. Well, the dialogue then unfolds with Phaedrus proposes that since we've done such heavy drinking the other night, instead of drinking, the Greeks would like sit back into these chairs, sort of half lying down, and there would be entertainment, probably flute girls and singing and dancing, and they would drink wine, and they decided this day for their entertainment they're going to send the flute girls away, the dancing away, and they're going to entertain themselves with conversation. And Phaedrus, the lover of language that we learned from other dialogues, he proposes that today we should give speeches in praise of Eros. Okay. I told you last time, for the Greeks, there was a god whose name was Eros, and there was a goddess who's closely associated with Eros, that's Aphrodite. And in some of the speeches, they just use the two gods and goddesses interchangeably. When you come to Socrates, he'll speak only of Eros. But that's a personification of something very important in life. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but all life comes from sexual union, even plant life. Wherever life there is, it comes from sexual union. So plants, animals, humans, all come from sexual union. So erotics is at the core of life. It's the source of life. So this is a very important drive, and many philosophers don't speak about it. By the way, the Greeks had another word for love. It's philia, and that meant more like friendship. And it was broader than our word friendship. It meant the bond that holds any group together is called philia. That's where we get the word philos and the word philosophia, philosophy. It means the closest word we have in English is friendship. So Plato had that word at his disposal, and he's a man of words, a great literary giant. He definitely knew the word philia, but he chose eros instead. And eros meant sexual desire, sexual attraction, much like it means today when we say the word erotic or erotics. So Phaedrus proposes, so that's important to know how all pervasive this drive, this desire is, and to know that it's the source of all life. Without it, there would be no life. Okay, so Phaedrus proposes that we give speeches in praise of Eros, that no poet had done that. Well, that's not really true, but let's just give him that. Plato knew that too. There are other poets that have given speeches in praise. By the way, a speech in praise of something is called a panegyric, and so they're going to give panegyrics in praise of Eros. And Socrates says, I for one cannot vote against this proposal because the only thing that I really know about is erotica. Erotika is the transliteration of the ancient Greek. Erotica, erotic matters. That's something, because in every other dialogue, Socrates claims he doesn't know what that reality is, and he's on the way towards trying to find out what it is. That's called Socratic ignorance or learned ignorance. In fact, in the Apology, he claims the pinnacle of wisdom is to know that you don't know. See, most people think they know and they don't know, and they act on that thinking that they know while they don't know, and they act on that, and they base their beliefs and actions on that. Like most people think they know all kinds of things. But upon examination, Socrates shows them they don't know. So why not just admit it right at the beginning that you don't know? Not about common things. I'm talking about ultimate things, like truth, like what is a republic, like what is freedom, and so on. Okay, but he does claim to know about erotica. So what does that tell me? Well, if you take, Plato's going to say the good life is the philosophical life. If you want to live the good life, you have to live philosophically. So what does it mean to live philosophically? It means that the word philos in the word philosophia is the word philosophy in Greek. Since you have two S's that come together, you can drop one of the S's, so it turns into philosophia. The philos in the word philosophia for Plato is really eros. And Socrates is the archetype philosopher. So, of course, if he knows anything, he would know about eros, because the very driving force towards wisdom is eros. The philos in the word philosophia for Plato, to repeat myself, is really eros. But it's not eros as commonly understood. It's going to be the spiritualization of eros towards higher and higher, more refined forms until finally it becomes the love of wisdom. So that's why he says at 177 DA, what are those letters, those numbers and letters mean? They're not page numbers. These are numbers that go into the margins of classical text, not just Plato, but any classic text. And they refer to the original text. And so when people quote, you don't have to do that when you quote, but when people quote from classical texts, sometimes they'll write at 177 D, line 8, and then everybody, no matter what edition it is, no matter what translation it is, no matter where it's published, everybody who sees that can go to that in the original text. So at 177D, and you'll find it in your text too, when Phaedrus proposes that instead of heavy drinking and entertainment with flute music and dancing girls, tonight we should take turns offering speeches in praise of Eros, panegyrics in praise of Eros. And Socrates replies, how could I vote no when the only thing I say I understand is the art of love, erotica. Okay, so, but in my commentary just now, before that, I told you it makes sense that he would know about erotica because Eros is the driving force of philosophy. In the word philos sophia for Plato, philos is really eros, spiritualized. So this statement that the only thing Socrates claims to have knowledge of is erotica, as we're going to see, Socrates demonstrates in his magnificent speech on Eros when it's his turn to speak. Socrates claims ignorance about all subjects save erotics. We're going to learn why and how this relates to Plato's moral philosophy when we listen to Socrates' speech on Eros. But we should also note Socrates' bold assertion implied in the claim concerning the evening's activity to speak on Eros also asserts that Socrates is well aware of his ignorance of all other matters. So that's enough on that point. I'm trying to illustrate to you as we move through this how we might take what's said and find our way to Plato's philosophy. By the way, I know I've said this, but it's worth repeating. This difficulty is unique to Plato. As soon as you turn to any of the other philosophers we're going to study in this course, or 95% of all the other philosophers, with some differences. For example, if you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche, that's a literary work and it's philosophical, and that's going to pose problems of interpretation similar to that of Plato's dialogues. But this is unique to Plato, that all we have are these dialogues, and that in the seventh letter he says he didn't write anything, his philosophy anywhere. So that poses philological challenges. By philological, I mean trying to interpret in such a way that we come into the neighborhood of Plato's own intentions. I don't think it's impossible. Most people don't even think about it. They just say Plato believed this, Plato believed that. I think that's not legitimate. And I'm not alone on that. Many Plato scholars, as I said, are with me on that. But some just say, well, then there's no way of finding our way to Plato's philosophy. It's just pleasurable pastime on his part. I don't go that far. I do think we can get into the neighborhood. But what's so wonderful about the dialogues is that these theories that Plato deconstructs in his dialogues are the best theories on the topic that's brought up. You see that, and then he just leaves the reader, okay, with Socrates' position, which far outstrips all the others, and as I told you, is probably closer to Plato's position. And he wants you, the reader, he wants us, if you don't agree with Socrates, or if you think it's lacking in any way, then continue the dialogue. He wants to encourage us to pick up where the dialogue left off. Now, what to do about these other... So the dialogue culminates in... It begins to culminate when Agathon gives his speech later on. First there's Phaedrus, then Pausanias, then Eryximachus, then Aristophanes, and then Agathon. So you have these 5 speeches, and each one are really great. And Plato creates these personages and these 5 very, very different speeches. I'll give you my ideas on each one of those in a outline form, rather than I have notes that we could speak. Sometimes I was I've been teaching this dialogue ever since I started teaching, like 40 years ago. So I used to like spend like 2 weeks on this dialogue and go through each speech and so on. But we don't need to do that. I can give you just an outline of each of these early speeches and give you my ideas about how to approach them, and then you can do with them as you wish. But the speech, after Agathon gives his speech, which leaves everyone spellbound, uh, he has Aristophanes sneeze because he's tickling his nose to stop his hiccups. It's this lighthearted thing that I've been telling you about. Um, and then it's Socrates' turn to speak. But instead of giving a speech, and this is important, and this is definitely Plato's, if we were to ask Plato if he were here, why did you have Socrates not give a speech at the beginning like everybody else? Well, his answer was, I wanted to show that Socrates' approach to revealing truth is very different from the ordinary approach. He thinks that truth is revealed through dialectics, through conversation, or through an inner dialogue, which is called thinking. But in this case, it's not inner, it's with other people. So he questions Agathon about Agathon's speech. And in that questioning, and this illustrates the dialectic, how it works, in that questioning, he has Agathon himself admit that what he said was only partially true and mostly incorrect. And he lays the foundations for his own speech. And then it turns, Socrates tells everyone that he had been, as he says, initiated into the mysteries of eros, of love, by a certain Diotima who was a priestess when he was very young. And he tells about how Diotima questioned him. So there's dialogue, dialectic again. Now Diotima, Socrates is telling everybody how Diotima questioned him. And you notice that it's the same questions that Socrates had posed to Agathon. And he even says that. It's not something hidden. He tells Agathon, these questions that I asked you and the way I changed my opinion about eros came from Diotima, and she questioned me and got me to realize what I got you to realize and everyone else here. And then he gives his own speech based on these principles, and it far outstrips all the others. Now you're in the precinct of Plato's philosophy. And so next time we'll start with Socrates questioning Agathon, and then Diotima questioning Socrates, and then Socrates' speech, and then I'll make some comments about Alcibiades comes in drunk, I told you, and he gives a speech about Socrates. I'll mention that. And that's how the dialogue, so it culminates in Socrates' speech. That's definitely if this were a piece of music, this is the crescendo, this is the culmination. So what do we do? Why did Plato write these other speeches then? Well, my own view, okay, so what are they again? First Phaedrus, then Pausanias, then Eryximachus, then Aristophanes, and then Agathon. And you have this lighthearted thing going on with Aristophanes having this case of the hiccups and trying to, Eryximachus, the doctor, tells him, well, tickle your nose and hold your breath, and that's going on. So that's sort of a comic thing that's running through these early speeches until when Agathon gives his very serious and rhapsodic speech on Eros, and you hear Aristophanes sneezing, at the end, which is comical because you have something very serious and deep, and then this ridiculous sneeze, from in case of hiccups with this comic poet, which is his muse to make people laugh, Aristophanes. Well, here's my view on these early speeches in general. They all have a grain of truth to them, you see. You want to look at them in retrospect from Socrates' speech. If you look at these early speeches from the point of view of Socrates' speech, you'll find elements of these early speeches in Socrates' speech. Only these elements will be transformed a certain way. I've given thought to this, in fact, thought about it this morning as I walked my dogs in the woods. This is the way philosophy moves. This is the way thinking moves. We don't think in a vacuum. So other people, other great thinkers have raised these issues. And the way great thinkers think is they listen to others. Even if they lived 2,500 years ago, like we're doing now with Plato, we can listen because of the written word. And so philosophy is this great conversation going on. And philosophers listen to each other, much like directors listen to each other. When somebody's building suspense in a film, you can be sure if they're a great director, they've watched Alfred Hitchcock and they know they've learned from him. And then they take it their own way and they change it. So, Freud took this whole notion of sublimation from Plato. He didn't even mention Plato, um, which he probably should have. I mean, it's so clear to me that since I've studied Plato, studied Freud, his whole notion of sublimation was already in ancient Greek thought in Plato. But he even calls Freud calls one of the great drives in the human unconscious is eros. He even uses Plato's word. But then he gives it his own meaning because he's a doctor and he gives it a physiological meaning and he starts talking about catharsis and he turns it into his own, he makes it his own. But that's what we do. We listen to each other, we find out what part of it is true. We take maybe the same words and we take some of the meaning, but then we make it our own, we change it. Because words are empty. Eros, anybody could say eros, anyone can say truth. But what do you mean by that? Like when somebody says, I believe in God, that doesn't tell me much. And my next question is, well, what do you think God is? And some people have really like cartoon characters about God. Other people have deep and profound notions of the ultimate, um, so it's not so much the words, it's what is meant by these words. So back to these early speeches, what Plato is doing, I think, is a kind of literature review, as we say today. Like, let's take the speech of Phaedrus, for example. Phaedrus's speech is the common view of Eros shared by the Greek people, perhaps mostly by the Athenians of the time. Phaedrus's speech is Plato's way of offering his readers an account of the view of Eros composed by the theological and epic poets of his day and given to the masses and then believed literally by the masses. Okay? It's the typical religious view thoughtlessly assimilated by the masses, by the hoi polloi, as we call them, the masses of people. This typical religious view of the god Eros, who personifies sexual desire, is animating Phaedrus's speech. So what is Plato doing here? Like if we were to ask Plato, why did you have Phaedrus give this speech? Well, Plato might say, this is the view that most people have of Eros. And I'm going to show you later on, in light of Socrates' speech, how paltry thing this is compared to somebody who's thought very carefully about such matters. It's Plato's way of educating his readers about what is untrue about Eros, or what it is that needs to be overcome if one wishes to take true Eros as his or her guide through life. As we're going to see, in light of Socrates questioning Agathon, and in light of Socrates' own speech on Eros, sexual desire has its place in Plato's view of Eros, at least in its initial stages. And sexual desire will play a part in the good life. Eros will also turn out to be for Socrates very near the divine, as Phaedrus says, but it itself is not a god. When we get to Socrates' speech, we're going to see it's not divine, it's not mortal, it's somewhere in between the mortal and the divine, in the realm of the daemonic, the spiritual realm. So it's a great spirit that bridges the gap between humanity and divinity. So Plato is showing in Phaedrus' speech how far the common view of Eros is from true Eros. And Plato's going to believe that way about most things. The way I see it, especially today, I mean, most people don't have time to think about such things. They're just trying. I mean, when you're in college, maybe if like you are taking a course, then and you're trying to get ready for the exam or something, then you'll do it. But as soon as you enter into the workaday world, most people are just, unless you're extremely rich, and then most rich people are not into this kind of thing either. But if you're just trying to put bread on the table and then relax from a hard day's work, you're not going to be thinking about how different the common view of Eros is from true Eros and how Eros plays a part in the good life. So Plato is saying that we need to part company with the common traditional view of Eros. Most people, in Plato's philosophy, you get this sense that most people simply assimilate the values, the convictions, the beliefs, the sensibility of the opinion makers of their times, and they don't give thought to it one way or another. I mean, as an example, I won't go into this too much, but let's take, see what, the mask, for example, wearing a mask during a pandemic. That's a scientific issue. It has nothing to do with politics, right? I mean, if you're a virus, are you a Democratic virus or a Republican virus, or a Trump supporting virus, or not? Or viruses don't have any political affiliation, right? So whether or not the mask, and I'm not saying it works or it doesn't work, I'm just saying the question of whether or not a mask is effective or to what degree it's effective in prohibiting the spread of the coronavirus, um, or defending against the coronavirus, that's a scientific issue. That has nothing to do with politics, right? And yet, in our country, it's completely divided along political lines. If you're a mask supporter, you're a Dem, a tree hugger. If you are against the mask, then you're a Republican. And then here's Dr. Fauci trying to defend himself, you know, on political issues. And he's a scientist. The mask either works or it doesn't, or it works to a certain degree or doesn't. It's a scientific issue. Here's the mask. Here comes the virus. Does it help or not? And it's like, so this is just one little ridiculous. I mean, it's an important issue for us today, but it illustrates the point that most people are not. I mean, the other day I was just coming from Hartville, and the people were standing on the corner, like protesting, screaming, "The masks don't work!" And like, the assumption is that they know more than the virologists and people with PhDs who are working, in that area. So that's true. I don't blame them that much. Maybe they just don't have time to think, or they don't give much thought to things. There's no time because of the economic pressures, perhaps. You just have to go to work, and then you just let your emotions. So this is a big theme in Plato's philosophy. If you read the Allegory of the Cave, for example, in the Republic, Book 7, which I teach a lot, the masses are living in deep delusion, thinking they're free and not free. And so philosophy comes, liberation comes only through philosophical reflection. So all these other speeches, I don't think I'm going to go through all of them, but there's an element of truth in all of them. Let's just take a few of them that I can illustrate. For example, Pausanias' speech, the next speech, he'll make a distinction between noble Eros and ignoble Eros, heavenly Aphrodite and earthly Aphrodite. And he's going to say that the heavenly Aphrodite is love of person's soul rather than just their body, and it's homosexual between two men, and it's the noble love, and so on. Well, if you look at that point in light of Plato's Socrates' speech, there will be a movement from the physical to the spiritual. And the spiritual will be more real and more noble than a purely physical kind of erotic drive. So there's an element of truth in that. It's just that he'll drop the whole homosexual issue. It doesn't matter if it's homosexual or heterosexual. But if it's purely physical, it will be more base than something that's physical but spiritualized. So there's an element of truth to it, but needs to be thought through. So what I was trying to get at earlier, I'm not being clear because this thought is very subtle and it's hard to articulate. But the way philosophy moves is we take whatever element of truth we find and we try to um, gather together the truth of that. Like there is a difference between noble love and ignoble love, but we think more deeply about it. Oh, let's take another element of some earlier speech. The next speech then was by Eryximachus, the doctor. I guess it was Aristophanes' turn to speak, but he has a case of the hiccups. So let's talk about the hiccups for a moment, just quickly. Why would Plato have Aristophanes? None of this even happened at all. It's all fiction, right? There might have been a celebration, but who knows? What matters is the text. Okay, so we have this text, and Plato has Aristophanes with this case of the hiccups. And it's his turn to speak, but he says, I can't speak. I have this horrible case of the hiccups, which is, it's comical because it's so biological. It has nothing to do with thought or anything. Sometimes I teach Bergson on comedy, and whenever things go from the spiritual or the intellectual immediately to the physical, it's comical. Yeah, have you ever, like when somebody's giving a speech and if they were hiccuping right in the middle of the main point they were going to give, or so Plato's using that as a comic thing. But so it's Aristophanes' time to speak, but he can't because he has the hiccups. So the doctor says, I'll speak then in your turn, but while I'm speaking, try this: tickle your nose with a feather or hold your breath. And he gives them all these things to do. So the reader is imagining that while Eryximachus is giving his speech, Aristophanes is doing all these ridiculous things, which are comical. So it's his way of poking fun, perhaps. It's Plato's way of poking fun of the haughtiness and of Aristophanes' speech. But when you read Aristophanes' speech, not Eryximachus' speech, he has this very broad sense of eros, which expanded my mind. See, what Plato's doing is showing different perspectives from different points of view. Like Phaedrus is the perspective of the theological and epic poets that have been appropriated by the masses and taken literally instead of figuratively. And then Pausanias, is a particular type of person. Eryximachus is a scientist, he's a doctor, and based on science. And then Aristophanes, the comic poet, and then Agathon, the tragic poet. So these are perspectives from they're different perspectives onto eros. And I've always thought that the more perspectives you see something from, the better you understand it. It's just that these perspectives are not as holistic and not as total. They're inadequate perspectives, but they do have grains of truth to them. You can only see that in light of Socrates' speech when you look in retrospect. So, for example, you have a very cosmic and wide view of eros, and edifying. Actually, I've learned from all these early speeches. Like you find the health in the body, he says, has to do with the harmony of the forces of your body. That's an incredible insight. When the body is in harmony with itself, you have health. If the forces are fighting one another, you have dis-ease, a disease. That's why you get sometimes you get a fever, for example. You get very hot because your body is burning up the virus or the bacteria that's causing the problem. Um, and it's trying to get back to a state of homeostasis, to equilibrium. Oh, he takes it into agriculture. When you have a drought, for example, you have too much water, not enough, or too much fire, not enough water. Or he takes it into the realms even of cosmology, about the harmony of the universe, and he takes it all the way to um, the relation of humans and divinity. So he expands the notion of eros and turns it into what the Greeks called harmonia, a harmony. Harmony and eros becomes synonymous, but he expands it and makes it cosmic. So that, I mean, that's a unique way of thinking about love, that love pervades this universe. It's responsible for the flourishing of any uh, of the plant life, of animal life, and all physical life. And then you come to Aristophanes' speech is comical and it's bizarre. He says, well, in order to know about Eros, you have to know about human nature in its beginnings. There were three sexes and not just two. There were males, females, and hermaphrodites. And they became so strong that Zeus, rather than put an end to the human race, he decided to cut them all in two. They had two faces, four arms, four legs, and they could do cartwheels and move very fast. And so the whole thing is a complete farce. So Zeus cuts them in two, and now when you have homosexual love between two men, that's the two parts that are trying to become whole again. And lesbian love are the two, is a female who's been cut in half. She's looking for her other half. And then heterosexual love is when hermaphrodites were cut in half. They're looking for their other half. And that's the reason for the embrace. That's this feeling, this longing to become whole. Now, take that very statement out of that ridiculous farce, the longing to become whole, and you'll find it in Socrates' speech, only completely recast. This is what I'm trying to, this is probably the best example so far, how it works. A recasting of ideas. So the longing to become whole, that's the truth, the true grain, the grain of truth that's found in Aristophanes' speech. And don't forget, Plato wrote this whole thing, right? So he can, there was a historical Aristotle. We have his plays now. In fact, he was responsible. He wrote a play called The Clouds, where it was a satire on Socrates, that he had his head in the clouds, and it was responsible for shaping public opinion about Socrates, and was pretty much instrumental in bringing about his execution. And Plato knew that, but he didn't bring that up in this dialogue in any way. But so there was a historical Aristophanes, but Plato creates his own Aristophanes, puts him in the speech, and has him puts him in the dialogue, has him give this speech, and about cutting these people in half. And now love is the longing to become whole. Now that's going to find its place, because how's it related to moral philosophy? Okay, Plato's going to say, if you want to live a good life, you have to live philosophically. What does it mean to live philosophically? It means to take the desire to procreate in beauty and to sublimate it, go through these ascending stages as we're going, as we're going to see. And at the final stages, you're going to see it has to, that driving force is going to drive the soul all the way to the pinnacle of insight into the ultimate. And the ultimate is the source of all life. It's the encompassing. Everything is within it. It is within everything. Everything comes out of it. It's the ultimate. It's the absolute beauty, he calls it. It's God, really, but he doesn't use the word God. He calls it absolute beauty. And that's going to be the pinnacle. And that's going to be the wholeness that we desire. Not our other half, our better half, as people say, but um, the whole, the insight into the encompassing, the ultimate. So all these dialogues, and then Agathon's speech, right before Socrates' speech, he attributes all the most lofty attributes to Eros. It's the most beautiful, it's the most good, and so on and so forth. And he gives a very rhapsodic speech. In fact, at the end, everyone is spellbound, except in that very moment, Aristophanes sneezes, and everybody probably laughs, or the reader is supposed to laugh. And then you have Socrates coming in and questioning Agathon. And out of that questioning, he lays the foundations for his speech that far outstrips them all. So I hope I didn't confuse you. I was dealing with something very subtle about what meaning, about how we can make sense of these early speeches. Um, and I couldn't help to realize years ago when I first started reading Plato that these early speeches find their way in Socrates' speech, only Socrates will refine them and put them in a, and recast them and rethink them in a deeper, much deeper way. Like, for example, this desire to become whole, for example, or the notion to about beauty and the good and so on. Okay, so let's have one more session. This time I'm going to focus on Socrates questioning Agathon, then Diotima questioning Socrates, and then Socrates' speech. All of that is Socrates' speech. When he's questioning Agathon, that's part of his speech. When he's telling everyone about when Diotima questioned him, that's part of his speech. And then the rest of his speech. And then the dialogue ends with Alcibiades coming in at the end. And we'll talk about that next time. So I hope this helps. This is part 2, and then we'll move into part 3 next time. Thank you.